is it what we hear in the mainstream? Because most of the things is because our ignorance, that we don't research, we don't go and read. Most of the things quite the contrary of what the mainstream feed us. So is that really what the actual numbers shows, that with regards to date, China versus IMF? If you can just fly us to that, and let's hear really what is the real information.
Okay, thank you so much, Mahlet, once again. So this will take me direct to the share of Africa's debt, or how it is being shared among us, whether you're talking about the international lending bodies or companies or corporations which are buying into when, for example, we raise bonds, we raise money through issuing bonds on the international market, whether it is the nations themselves and whether it is the multilateral institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and then the other institutions, of course, like BRICS Bank, which is being created in Shanghai, and all the other possible institutions where we are likely to borrow from, like China and its private companies. So when you look at the debt of the continent, actually, the ownership of this debt is being led by the IMF. Like I mentioned, starting with the 1960s, the IMF had become very strong because the United States was in a very good position economically. That is why you see that the IMF was very strong, extremely strong. And Nkrumah was warning us about these institutions, how they are coming. And even Nkrumah went to the extent of writing a full book about the mechanism of neocolonialism. The book is called Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. And we will see it further as we are going into the presentation. So Nkrumah warned us about these institutions, how they are coming. This did not mean that Nkrumah did not go in to borrow. He went in to borrow money, but at the same time, Nkrumah saw that this is dangerous, that we are doing. Why is it dangerous? Because it is enslaving, our people. It is enslaving our people. And then he proffered a solution, and the only solution was unifying Africa, making it stronger, like we are saying right now, and integrate our economies, integrate our GDP. It is on very few occasions that you hear India has gone to the IMF to borrow. Why? And yet our economy as Africans is slightly bigger than that of India. Why? It's because we are still disintegrated. So Nkrumah warned us about this. Now, the debt started exploding after the leaders of the independence generation were overthrown. And then they destroyed the industries, because the IMF's purpose, the Western world's purpose, like we have mentioned consistently, was to have control over two things on the African continent. Number one was the material resources of the African continent. Number two, the control over the markets. The control over the markets of the African continent, it means having control over the population of Africa. Doing things like social engineering so that the Africans will be able to like products which come from the West. And then you take their materials, you take it to Paris, London, everywhere, Britain and the United States and all over Europe, make these products from their own materials and bring it back, advertise to them, and then show them that European products are superior. So that is what it means to have control over the markets and material resources. This Nkrumah wrote about it in his book, Africa Must Unite. And it is a repeated theme. He repeated it even in majority of his books, even when you are talking about consensusism, even when you are talking about neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, the two major reasons they came here was the material and markets. Even before colonialism, when they came with slavery, these are the things which they came here. So they would not allow, they could not afford to allow Africa to industrialize, because the moment you industrialize the African continent, it means you have taken the material forces, the material resources from them. Then Africa is going to manufacture its own aircraft. Africa is going to manufacture its own automobile cars. It's going to manufacture its own televisions. It's going to manufacture its own electronics, lights, bulbs, irons, and whatever electronics, all the electronics, phones, radios, all these semiconductors. And that means the West would stop growing. So it was necessary to use institutions like the IMF to come to Africa and then tell them that the only way for the continent to develop is to privatize everything. Privatize everything. And it is unfortunate that even some of the most educated people on the African continent were not able to figure this out. And that is actually after they have overthrown the independence generation, majority of the independence generation who were resisting, if you go back. So the people who came after them, majority of them, of course, were educated in the West, and they were taught that the only way to develop is the way which the white man tells you, the Western world. And I'm trying to emphasize this because the institutions of the West, they are integrated in their government. They are integrated, the financial, the military, and the governing systems and businesses. They are integrated together. They work together as a giant machine. And that giant machine goes out to the world to exploit the world. So if you do not take care of yourself, if you do not think for yourself, then they will think for you. They will force for you to think like them, as we have seen on numerous cases. So they came, destroyed the industries, and they started saying that the only way to develop is to privatize everything. And even up to now, we hear people saying, have bought into this falsehood, this false narrative. You can go all across the African continent. But privatization is not the only way to develop, but rather a mixed economy, what we call a mixed economy. And this is what all of them have done. Even the United States, it used the state and private capital. When you go to Singapore, which is normally brought up as an example when you are talking about Africa and Singapore also, it used the state and private capital. South Korea is the same. China is is the biggest example. Britain itself, it was run, and France, it was run on state and private. So it was a mixed economy. But in Africa, when you come, they are always telling us the only way to do it is through privatization. So they sold all our industries. When you go to Nigeria, if you read a book which was written about Dangote, the richest black man in the world, you can see the writers try to examine what happened in Nigeria during that period of privatization, that industries which were going to help the country were privatized off, were destroyed, sold to individuals, and some of them, they did not have any interest in running these industries. Even some of the foreigners who bought them, they just abandoned them, and they got spoiled. This was the strategy of the West, to destroy all the industries so that the industries in Africa could not compete. And this, we can even see it today with what is happening with China, that they are trying to fight against Chinese industrialization. So Africa's industrialization was fought against even before getting off the ground. So they came in, they say, if you sell it, we give you money so that you can be able to, to pay the civil servants. And so that's when Africa's debt started exploding, up to the extent where we are today. Like according to 2021 data, our debt to GDP, our debt to the whole Africa's debt, owed to all the lenders across the globe is around $645 billion. 645, close to $650 billion. That is the total. Now we want to break down this and look at how much do we owe the West and how much do we owe China. Mahlet asked me a question. We have seen the talk, the China debt trap, the China debt trap, the China debt trap. This has been repeated on numerous, occasions. Now we want to see how much does China share of the debt which Africa is owing to everyone else across the globe. Of the 650 billion, how much does China, what is the percentage that China has? But we will first see what is the West, what is the share of the West. Now, when you are talking about the West, the share of the West, when you filter out the information of China, the debt which Africa owes the West is $560 billion. $560.73 billion. That is out of the 650 billion. Africa owes the West combined, the governments, the IMF, because the IMF has been the leader and the World Bank. They have been the leader in this enterprise of extracting, interest through these loans. The IMF has been the leader. And we have had even people like Dr. Chombori Kwao complain about this and say, Africa, when it is given loans, it is given at a higher interest rate of 7 to 9%. The United States, which already has money and is already rich, when it goes to the IMF, and of course it is the one which is leading in putting money in this bank. It puts almost annually up to $80 billion in the up to 80 to $90 billion. So when the United States goes to borrow, it is given 4% interest rate, which doesn't make sense in the in the real world, because they already have money. Why would they get a lower interest rate, and the poor people who don't have money, they get higher interest rate? They are burdened with higher interest rates. And that is what it means by neocolonialism. That is what it means that you are being colonized, that you are colonies of these people, because they started these institutions. It is their policy that you should pay this, you should continue to be enslaved. So the share of debt which the West has of the total debt of Africa is 560.73, and that translates to 77%. They own 77% of Africa's debt. That is the West. 77% of Africa's debt. That is $560.73 billion. They own 77% of Africa's debt. When we go to China, China's share of Africa's debt is $84.12 billion. The West is 560 billion. China is 800. China is $84 billion. Now, when you convert China's percentage, it translates to 13%. The West, it is 77%. China, it is 13%. So, looking at the real data which we are presenting to you today, with the source which is there that you can go yourself and find out from the International Debt Statistics database, it is evident that China is not the one which is burdening Africa with the debt, because China's share of Africa's debt is only 13%. The Western share of Africa's debt is 77%. But they are not talking about their burdening of Africa with debt. They are talking about China. Why? Because we know that China, its debt has been more productive on the African continent